If you know anything about the history of first-person shooters, then you probably know how important Tom Clancy was in bringing a focus towards realism to the genre. At the time, shooters like Doom and Quake focused on fast movement and twitchy reflexes, and established video game elements like health packs and power-ups. But as a writer of military fiction, Clancy wanted to draw inspiration from real-world military techniques and scenarios for a game. The result was Rainbow Six. Released in 1998, the player controlled a multinational counter-terrorism unit. At the beginning of each level, the player would get to see in-depth blueprints of the building under enemy control, and was tasked with selecting a team of operatives and planning their route through the area, as well as accompanying them. You had to be slow and methodical, working to spot unsuspecting enemies and plan new routes to flank them. And you had to do it well, because even though enemies died in just one or two shots, you did too. And if your highly trained operatives died due to your mistakes, you weren't getting them back. This focus on high stakes and realism was met with great success, leading to more Rainbow Six games, as well as other series under the Tom Clancy name, such as Ghost Recon and Splinter Cell. His game company was later purchased by Ubisoft, who continued to develop the various Clancy properties, and while this helped his brand reach a greater audience, the games themselves started to gradually become less complex and difficult, primarily to compete with other military series such as Battlefield or Medal of Honor. The tactical elements were still there, but the punishments that made them necessary for the player to use weren't, and that made some of the games less unique as a result. After 2008's Rainbow Six Vegas 2, the series had more or less dried up, and this was probably because Ubisoft just didn't see a point in competing with the juggernaut that was Call of Duty. In 2011, a proof-of-concept trailer for Rainbow Six Patriots was leaked online. What footage and screenshots we got out of it clearly didn't represent a finished game, but even so, they did not showcase any kind of tactical combat, and instead seemed to be focusing on delivering an uncomfortably edgy narrative. It kind of looked like Battlefield 3 and Heavy Rain had a baby, but not in a good way. And I'll admit, I was really curious about the project after reading interviews with the developers, but then they were all fired a few months later. This understandably made people really wary of the project, which ended up getting quietly shelved as Ubisoft figured out how they could repurpose what they'd been working on. The public wasn't made aware of any of this until the reveal of Rainbow Six Siege, which released at the end of 2015. So let's put ourselves in my shoes for a minute. It's December of 2015. I just beat Fallout 4, and I ran to the store as fast as I could to get a refund. I see this new Rainbow Six game that I barely remember them advertising, and I'm a little unsure of it. I pretty much gave up on Ubisoft as a whole after Assassin's Creed 3 was a massive letdown, and I hadn't really bought any of their games since about 2012. They didn't win any points with me after abandoning series that I liked in favor of diffusing Assassin's Creed's formula into everything they were making. Rainbow Six Siege isn't like that though. It's being marketed more like some kind of multiplayer esports game, like Battlefield 3 and Counter-Strike had a baby this time. To make matters more confusing, it wasn't until a month or two before the game released that Ubisoft clarified that Siege did not feature any single-player story content whatsoever, in spite of releasing really expensive-looking cinematics that suggested that there was one. Now, I hadn't really played a military shooter in several years, primarily because Spec Ops: The Line had convinced me to go outside and enjoy life. Basically what I'm trying to say is that this whole thing was, at the time, a very wishy-washy purchase for me to make, even if I ended up getting it relatively cheap because I was exchanging it for Fallout 4. But buying Siege, after all, ended up being one of the best calls I've made in several years. Siege is a bold game that makes a lot of changes to the Rainbow formula. Gone are the elaborately designed single-player missions, as Siege is indeed designed to be a competition-based multiplayer shooter with a bit of tutorials and PvE content on the side to help show you the ropes. The tactical knowledge and high-stakes combat that the series is known for is still there, but it's been turned on its head. All matches of Siege involve one team assaulting a building to locate the objective, such as a hostage in need of rescue or a bomb that needs to be defused. The defending team needs to fortify their position and stop the attackers from completing the objective within a time limit. The maps themselves are still complexly designed and accommodate destructible walls and floors wonderfully, while also feeling very realistic. Because combat usually only centers around the room where the objective is held and its nearby entry points, each map feels like it has the depth of 3 or 4 from your average shooter. It's important that we go over the differences between the two sides in greater detail. Attackers come equipped with grappling hooks, grenades, and breaching charges to slip in through windows and open up holes on the map however they please. Defenders, however, can reinforce most walls with metal, which makes them indestructible and limits the attacker's options. Both sides have access to great tools for gathering information as well, whether it's the attacker's remote-controlled drones or the defender's static security cameras. It's easy to see the effects of map destruction as a big focus for the game, maybe even a little gimmicky, but I would argue that knowledge of the map, your blind spots, what areas enemies can shoot at you from, etc., is just as important, if not more so. This isn't even bringing up how each side has its own pool of selectable characters who each have their own unique ability that can really ruin your day if your own team's abilities don't counter theirs. Thermite uses special charges to destroy reinforced walls, but those can be destroyed if Bandit uses his batteries to electrify the wall first. But Twitch's drone can sneak in and destroy those batteries, so you need to use Mute's jammers to counter it and render the drone useless. But Fuse's cluster bombs are also really good at destroying what's on the other side of walls, so it's up to Jaeger to neutralize the grenades in midair with his gadget. Ubisoft's serious about the meta here, so much so that weaker characters are constantly getting reworked or buffed in fair ways. And every time they release a new pair of operators, the meta gets seriously shaken up. It's a perfect example of how the game is constantly evolving. That evolution is probably why Siege's base has only kept increasing since launch, even with the money train that is Overwatch coming out not too long after it. Tons of multiplayer-focused games seem to lose public interest a few months after they come out, even with lofty plans for year-long downloadable content. But why is it that Siege didn't join them? The first big reason is that Siege provides a much more hardcore experience than a lot of recent shooters do. There's no respawns in any game mode whatsoever, so you're punished for your mistakes by being forced to sit out for the rest of the round. That said, they still give players something to do when they're dead, which I really appreciate. Dead players still have access to whatever camera network the team has, as well as the ability to use their microphones to communicate, which means a lot more in this game than most. But that's a consolation prize at best, because a well-placed headshot is going to throw a wrench into any team's plan, especially if the victim didn't get a chance to use their unique gadget to try to tip the scales. There's nothing more satisfying than a team working together to pull off a win without losing anyone after spending dozens of matches learning the intricacies of the maps and the gadgets and team compositions. I was a little skeptical of this game's esports potential, especially since Ubisoft seemed to be hyping it up a lot prior to release. But after playing it for God knows how many hours, I would argue that the designer's interest in creating a genuinely unique shooter, rather than something that just superficially looked like Counter-Strike, is what caused Siege to earn its Pro League. All of the skill and knowledge that comes from understanding the intricacies of the game could have been really screwed up if there was a bad progression system on top of all of that. And thankfully, that's not the case. When you're a new player, you're going to be spending the currency you earn from matches to unlock the new operators. But after that, there isn't really anything you can spend it on that affects your gameplay. At this point, it's purely cosmetic skins and the like, which isn't too different from a lot of other games of this type, but other games like to dole this out to you randomly in loot boxes. But here you can select whatever you want and spend your money directly on it. There's a handful of premium items that do require real money, but it's a small amount compared to other games, and the fact that there's no randomization is a huge plus. It's not pay to win, and there's no paying for the chance of something. There are a few players that do seem to be nervous because they've announced that a loot box system is going to be implemented in the game soon, but I would argue that as long as the original economy remains the same, this is just a bonus way to get skins. It's icing on the cake. While we're talking about the content seasons for the game, let me make it clear that Ubisoft has done an uncharacteristically great job of providing new content at no additional cost. Since launch, we've gotten 6 new maps, with at least 3 more planned by the end of the year, and every content season introduces 2 new characters who can be purchased with in-game currency, although to be honest, you're probably just better off buying the ones you like flat out. Or maybe going for the season pass that gets all of them, but I'd only recommend that if you really like the game. This business model is a large reason why I think the game survived this long and continues to get content after its 1-year point, which is usually the standard. Ubisoft's already starting to use this model for other games that they're coming out with, like the recently released For Honor, and I wouldn't be surprised if the whole company is trying to make a shift towards truly deep multiplayer offerings as opposed to their skin-deep single-player ones. I'm not saying Ubisoft has run everything perfectly. There were a lot of matchmaking errors with this game at launch, and it seemed to be something that was constantly getting fixed. And for the record, the latest content season did have a pretty rocky startup. But I think the fact that Ubisoft is so responsive, constantly doling out new patches that either change gameplay or health, shows a serious level of dedication, and it should be commended. All in all, the story of Siege is a fantastic example of how much games can change throughout their development. Look at its origins as Patriots, and then the bare-bones alphas, then its hidden gem status when it first launched, and now it's a bona fide hit. There's never been a better time to get in on the action. There's absolutely nothing like it on the market, so check it out if you're a fan of shooters. It's one of my personal favorites of 2016. It might not be the kind of game Tom Clancy would have produced, but hopefully it's the kind of game he would have respected. It's easy to see the effects of destruction on the map is a big focus for the game, maybe even a gimmick, but I would argue that knowledge of what's going on and keeping track of your blind spots using your cameras and other methods of information gathering is just bleh. Oh my god. I want to die. Why? I'm trying so hard to get these lines right.